the thing that moved me the most was not the circumstance, not even the idea that this was a woman, an actress, but it was the exploration of the violence that we can have against ourselves. Like, to me, that it just hit me in my gut so deep in a way that felt not even attached to gender, but just to our humanness. And it also just felt like something that, just as an actor, that would be such an interesting thing to dive into, kind of the rawness of that.
Let's start by talking about sort of what was your first reaction when you got this script from Qualley Fauché?
Well, first of all, I was kind of stunned and extremely captivated. Yeah. I feel like I had never just read anything like it in the same way that I don't know if I've ever seen anything like it. It was a very detailed script, and I was, sorry. Sorry, what's happening, Mouse? Sorry, sorry, she's leaving us. But but I was so moved by it. One, I love the subject matter, and I thought it was such an interesting way of delving into this. But the thing that moved me the most was not the circumstance, not even the idea that this was a woman, an actress, but it was the exploration of the violence that we can have against ourselves. Like, to me, that it just hit me in my gut so deep in a way that felt not even attached to gender, but just to our humanness, and it also just felt like something that, just as an actor, that would be such an interesting thing to dive into, kind of the rawness of that.
Well, I mean, because obviously there's incredible prosthetics work and there's incredible makeup work, but one of the most affecting scenes is just you in front of the mirror, putting on and taking off the makeup. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that scene and how that scene sort of connected to this idea, the preparation for the date and then just sitting on the bed at the end of it. Like, how did that connect to this idea that you loved so much about the script?
Well, first of all, normally you have someone else that you're playing off of. So to have the majority of my scenes be in, the context of just being in the intimacy of how we are when we are alone. And so it felt really important to me, even before day one of shooting, that I spent a really solid 2 weeks going through the script to really anchor into the emotional reality, so that at every moment I felt like my thoughts were alive, that the relationship that I was having was not dependent on anything else. So when we got to that scene, I felt like I had kind of the freedom to explore just that kind of arc of potential hopefulness, that she has just that sliver of hope to escape that self-imposed prison, and how easily when we slip into that compare and despair, that we kind of bottom out into becoming paralyzed. And this is obviously an exaggerated moment, I think, but we've all had that moment of, let me just make it a little better, and it just gets worse and gets worse till then we're frozen. And in this case, it was just needing to open myself up to the depths of self-loathing and self-hatred that can exist in us.
You mentioned that this is such an isolated character, but you also have this two-hander with Margaret. And so I was wondering...
Oh, I love and adore. I really do. And do feel in so many ways we are one, and that we, really were looking out for each other throughout.
Well, I was wondering about that. Like, did you have conversations with her going, before you got onto set, about sort of the versions of this character that you would be playing?
I mean, what's interesting is, we had some connection. Obviously, I did a movie with her mother, one of my first films. She knew my daughters. So there was an interesting kind of familiarity. But also, I feel like our approach to things was very similar. So we didn't need a lot of lengthy dialogue to actually really have connected. But I will say, as we were both naked laying on the cold tile floor, there was a point when, and Margaret's having to just fall with her full weight on me. She said, "Thank God we like each other, or this would be really awkward." But, there were things that, if you really look in a certain way, as we are one, but almost if you imagine somebody who's reincarnated, right? And as Sue gets the opportunity to live in her own body, she really actually starts to become a separate person. But anyway, does that answer the question?
It
But,
does.
but I also think just the way in which we were there for one another, it was obviously a very vulnerable experience. And having someone that I, one, admire her work and knew that just in Qualley's choice in Margaret, what a difference and what an elevated difference it would be.
Qualley's world is heightened, and it is, the colors are so bright. The yellow coat, for example, the leotard, and it's a world that's ours, but a sort of mirror image of it. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about sort of what it was like to play in that world while rooting, as you said, in this like truth of what Elizabeth is going through.
Well, what's interesting is, Qualley is a very visual and symbolic storyteller. And so a lot of her focus and time really went into that. And what I felt was a big part of my job, and I think Margaret as well, was keeping it anchored in reality, since Qualley likes everything to be at 110. But as we know, if everything's at 110, there's no nuance, there's no, place to go. And so keeping it anchored in reality was really, I felt like, a big part of what was, my job to bring to the table.
Yeah. I mean, I think we have to talk about going into it. How much did you know about sort of like what the prosthetic and the makeup process would be?
I had done some, but nothing like this. I mean, I had anywhere from 6 to 9.5 hours sitting in the chair, and a good hour and a half to take it off. But the interesting thing is also there wasn't a lot of time. It's not like you can practice with it. It's very fragile. Each day was all new pieces. But just doing the head and shoulders of the last part, which Qualley kind of referred to as Gollum, was that just the head and shoulders was 6 hours. But the interesting thing is the time sitting in the chair, needing to be still and be with yourself, almost allowed for the transition of kind of finding a different body, finding a different relationship with yourself. But, spending all days hunched over, I don't recommend. But this had a lot of physicality, obviously. And I think the interesting thing was trying to figure out what the rules and logic were of the world. Because here I am totally degraded, but I can haul ass down the hallway. I mean, I kept saying, I don't know, would she be able to run that fast? Yes, she can. And so there was, or even the strength that Sue has to smash my face into the glass, or she can beat the crap out of me and I'm still crawling. But I think that's an interesting part of, the way in which Qualley takes you on this journey that is also then so out of reality that it almost gives you a reprieve to take in the intensity of what this story is really trying to impart.
Well, I was wondering if you could talk maybe a little bit too about sort of how you thought about the mental degradation that she's going through, like in tandem with the physical, like when the hand starts to go, like how did that sort of affect your performance as you were sort of slowly putting these little parts of it on?
I think it was, again, it was so much about what I did before I ever got there, so that I could just be present to experience it in the moment, so that then I could follow impulses. And I was doing actually an interview earlier today, and it's the first time I had mentioned it, but one of the weirdest things possible, which I don't know if this just shows how we can manifest, but as we were getting to the hand, I realized my own finger created its own bump that I did not start the film with.
That's crazy.
I was like I showed the prosthetics. I said, what you're putting on my finger, my own hand just did.
Oh my God. That's wild. How did that
I
feel?
didn't take the substance. Nothing's really come out of my back.
There's no one running around on.
But it was just one of those weird things. Yeah. Anyway, little anecdote.
Well, I mean, how did you think about also playing this her Elizabeth's sort of stubbornness too? Like, I love the phone calls where she's on, she's there. She's calling to complain, and then she hangs up and says, I'm not going to give up. I'm not going to give up doing this. And I was wondering if you thought about, like, how you thought about that stubbornness of her.
Well, I mean, I think, it's that pursuit of perfection, which does not exist. And once you've kind of bought into something, which is kind of part of what, I looked at in this. It's for me, it's never really like the circumstances. Yes. Does it exist that there are beauty kind of standards? Is there an aspect to us, in particular for women having been sidelined at a certain age? But the reality is we have bought into it. And so when we change how we hold ourselves, when we value ourselves differently, then the world outside will catch up and change with us. Yeah. And so I think in that same way, the intensity of what's happening is, Elizabeth's world is very isolated. I mean, as you can see, she has no friends, no family. There's no other reflection until she has that moment where she's getting ready for the date. Like, that's why that was so important, because it was, if she could have just stepped out. But once she's bought into that idea, what I loved is, that as she's beginning and she's blaming the other side, which is still her. We all do that, where we're looking to find something outside of us to be the problem, when the reality is it's all within us.
Yeah. You mentioned these impulses. You mentioned these impulses that you had on set that you were able to. Can you talk a little bit about that and sort of like acting on them, and how impulsivity and sort of what you could do just in the moment really shaped your performance?
Well, it's interesting that, Coralie was very set. Mm-hmm. She had a very certain idea of what she wanted and how she wanted it. And, but the scene that I think I could kind of explore with this, that was like on the page, the cooking scene, actually didn't read funny. And so as it evolved, with the leg and then getting up, looking at the cookbook, like it wasn't in there to, add in that my eyes had changed and perhaps wasn't able to read, or my own disgust at the cookbook. And so those were all just things that just occurred in the moment as we were going. And kind of the sense of madness was in there, but I don't remember it really reading it with humor. And so that's what I mean about sometimes. And also, this was so foreign that, again, it's just being present to react to kind of what's in front of you.
Yeah. I was wondering, how, like, what was it like sort of on a day-to-day basis with Coralie? Like, what was your dynamic like as you were doing these very intense, very practical, scenes with a lot of effects and makeup?
I mean, it was, I would say this is probably the hardest shoot I've ever had. And, I think most of us are used to a kind of certain format. Like, we start with a wide, and then we kind of start to warm into it, and then we move in, and then we kind of feel like, oh, I'm really there. Coralie often liked to start this close, where you had no spatial awareness, you had no sense. And that, again, it's not it's not a good or bad. It just was what it was, and very different and quite challenging. Yeah. And again, I just keep going back to, which is why, my inner life had to be so intact and alive for this, because I couldn't count on it coming from the outside.
Yeah. I was wondering, if you could talk a little bit about the fight sequence with Margaret.
I have to say, I looked so forward. It was the only time we were both conscious. Yeah. I mean, and I so really love and adore and admire Margaret. And it was really like, it was a difficult scene. Physically complicated because there were so many parts.
What was the prep that went into that?
Well, the day started first with just 6 hours of prosthetics for me, and then having all of the details of the syringe, and then also then having to kind of shake all of that external off to try to stay anchored in, what the emotion was that of basically having to try to kill off a part of yourself that's killing you.
Yes, yeah.
And that was, it was intense. And then the other part, the fight part, the chase part was actually kind of fun outside of having to do it hunched over.
Yeah. How did you think about the physicality? Like, obviously there is the prosthetics, but there is the physicality that changed. How did you map out how her physicality would change over the course of the film?
There was part of it, that ahead of time, kind of trying to think through what that would be, just by knowing what was created for the body, just what it physically had transformed into, and then taking it from there. And some of it was trial and error because some days it was very different having the full prosthetic on versus it being a pad. And so trying to make sure that was consistent. Really like I was asking, and relying on others to make sure and help me. Because it is different when you have something that's like stuck or glued to your body versus that is this kind of very hard formed weighted piece versus a padding.
Yeah.
And so again, it was just trying to find it so that I felt like I was kind of more aligned with it as one. But again, as you can see, I'm like getting there. Yeah. In the makeup chair, as this happened, there was a sense of also like it naturally made me want to contract and hide and pull within myself and not be seen. And so that was, again, it's like when sometimes how different costumes completely change how you carry yourself and move you immediately into another space. I feel like the prosthetics can do that, except the one difference is I felt like I needed a few moments of just time looking at myself so that I could remember. Because when you're inside, you're still you. Yeah. So having some just even if it was just 3-4 minutes of mirror time and just kind of taking in that reflection was also very helpful.
Yeah. We have to wrap up soon, but I did want to ask about, your face on Monstro, on Monstro Eliza Sue. Tell us a little bit about how that came together.
So, obviously this idea that we are one. And, that is one of the few, because everything was practical effects, except that was a mold that I then had to do in visual effects animate, which was, like sitting and awkward. But then the part at the end, like having to squeak up to the star, felt like for me, I kind of found what my connection to it was just in a way trying to get back to where I started, in that idea that she's getting back to finally letting go of the physical to be free.
Wow. Well, that's a perfect way to end. Thank you.
Do you guys want to open it up? Does anybody have any questions? I always like to see if, okay.
First of all, wow. It was like a cautionary tale. And it was just amazing. Was it claustrophobic when you were screaming with all that prosthetic stuff and all that makeup? Was it claustrophobic at any point?
I actually didn't feel claustrophobic. I mean, sometimes in the chair, because there were pieces that had to get so close to the eye, once it's on, you can't really eat or drink because with that, it was over my mouth and it's so delicate. I think the harder part of where you feel claustrophobic is not when you're working, it's the in-between and constantly being touched. Like by the end of the day, you're like, fuck off. Is what you'd like to say. I didn't say it because I really appreciated the makeup people because they were so amazing. But that's really, like when you're just being touched all day, that's it.
Yeah, it was amazing.
Yeah.
Oh, this is my favorite movie of the year. I've seen this is my third time seeing it.
Oh my God.
And I wanted to ask, what is your headcanon for how Fred is doing?
What is my, say it again, my,
Like, how do you think Fred is doing?
oh my God, poor Fred, so rejected. I mean, really, like it was such a selfish, narcissistic moment. No, I feel so bad for Fred. Fred? He's still waiting. I did see a meme that basically had that scene, and it says, if you see this, you know I'm not showing up.
Have you enjoyed the memes?
Oh my God, they have, because, you know, a couple of other things. First of all, to have a film that people have been motivated to want to see in the theater just kind of gives me hope for, because our shared experience is so important, and we've all kind of been leaning towards a little isolation. And if I look at Elizabeth Sparkle as any indication, it's the isolation that creates her absolute destruction. And so I feel really proud that this film has, you know, brought people out. And the fact that it's kind of, you know, brought this kind of joyous, you know, expression and touched people in a humorous, entertaining way. It's been great fun. I love it. I love it. Thank you guys so
so
much.
much.
Thank you.